Imagine a world dominated by towering Gothic cathedrals, symbols of unwavering faith and burgeoning prosperity. These architectural marvels, reaching towards the heavens, stood as testaments to the thriving cities and the intricate societal tapestry of 14th-century Europe. But beneath this veneer of grandeur lurked a fragility, a confluence of factors that would soon transform this landscape into a breeding ground for unimaginable devastation. The Black Death, one of history's most catastrophic pandemics, didn't simply appear out of nowhere. It was the culmination of existing vulnerabilities, a perfect storm brewing beneath the surface of a seemingly flourishing civilization. This plague, carried by fleas on rodents, decimated populations and irrevocably altered the course of European history. To understand its impact, we must delve into the conditions that made Europe so susceptible to such a disaster. The 14th century witnessed a population boom across Europe, reaching levels unseen since the Roman Empire. With approximately 80 million inhabitants, the continent was experiencing unprecedented growth. Cities swelled, trade flourished, and magnificent structures rose from the ground. However, this expansion strained resources, particularly food production. Agricultural practices struggled to keep pace with the growing population, leading to widespread food shortages. Farmlands were divided into increasingly smaller plots, leaving peasant families with barely enough to sustain themselves. This precarious situation meant that any disruption to the harvest could have catastrophic consequences. And in the early 14th century, disaster struck in the form of the Great Famine. Beginning in 1315, Europe endured a period of prolonged and intense cold, a consequence of what is now known as the Little Ice Age. Torrential rains flooded fields, destroying crops and leaving communities devastated. The relentless downpours continued for months, preventing the planting and harvesting of essential grains. The consequences were dire. The famine lasted for 3 agonizing years, from 1315 to 1317, with repercussions that lingered for decades. Grain prices skyrocketed, pushing food beyond the reach of ordinary people. Desperate peasants resorted to eating wild plants, roots, and even tree bark in a desperate attempt to survive. Some accounts even speak of cannibalism, a testament to the extreme hunger that gripped the continent. The Great Famine resulted in widespread death and debilitation. Those who survived were weakened and more susceptible to disease. Children born during this period suffered from malnutrition and compromised immune systems. An entire generation grew up physically weakened, making them easy targets for future epidemics. This widespread malnourishment significantly lowered the population's resistance to illness, setting the stage for the horrors to come. Adding to the problem of food scarcity were the unsanitary conditions prevalent in medieval cities. Rapid urbanization led to overcrowding and a complete lack of proper sanitation. Cities were characterized by narrow, winding streets, open sewers, and a general disregard for hygiene. Waste and refuse were routinely dumped into the streets, creating a breeding ground for disease. People often threw the contents of their chamber pots out of windows, with only a shout to warn unsuspecting passers-by. This waste accumulated in open ditches and puddles, rarely cleaned and posing a significant health hazard. Houses were built close together with poor ventilation, and families often lived in cramped quarters, further increasing the risk of infection. Personal hygiene was also severely lacking. Bathing was infrequent, as it was believed that frequent washing was detrimental to health. The prevailing belief was that hot water opened the pores of the skin, allowing harmful substances to enter the body. As a result, people preferred to simply wipe their faces and hands, rather than engage in full bathing. While public bathhouses existed in some larger cities like Paris and London, they gradually closed down in the early 14th century due to concerns about disease and immorality. These conditions fostered the proliferation of parasites, particularly rats and fleas, which thrived in the unsanitary environment. Unbeknownst to the people of the time, fleas living on rats were the primary vectors for Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague. However, the connection between rodents and disease was not understood. Instead, people attributed epidemics to miasmas, poisonous vapors emanating from rotting waste and swamps, or to divine punishment for their sins. Cities, therefore, became ideal incubators for disease. Even minor infections could quickly spread through the population, escalating into major epidemics. The high mobility of people, driven by trade and pilgrimage, further exacerbated the situation. Diseases could easily be transported over long distances, and there was no understanding of how to contain them. Medieval medicine was woefully inadequate to deal with serious epidemics. Doctors relied on ancient theories of humorism, based on the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen, which posited that illness resulted from an imbalance of the four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. University-trained physicians of the 14th century were also influenced by Arab scholars such as Avicenna and Rhazes, but they still adhered to the same ancient theories. Treatment typically involved bloodletting, purging, and the application of herbal remedies. The concept of bacteria and infection was completely unknown. Consequently, any disease that overwhelmed the body's natural defenses became uncontrollable and deadly. Despite outward appearances of prosperity and growth, Europe in the early 14th century was exceptionally vulnerable to a major epidemic. Overcrowded cities with appalling sanitation, a population weakened by recent famine, high levels of mobility, and the utter helplessness of medieval medicine created the perfect conditions for a tragedy of immense proportions. The stage was set for the arrival of the Black Death. The first signs of impending doom arrived from the distant eastern fringes of the Christian world. In the 1340s, the Mongol army of Khan Janibek laid siege to the Genoese fortress of Kaffa, located on the Crimean Peninsula. This was a vital trading post connecting Europe with the East. The siege had been ongoing for several months when a strange and rapidly spreading disease suddenly broke out within the Mongol ranks. Soldiers began dying by the hundreds, and the army quickly dwindled. Faced with their inability to overcome the disease and unwilling to retreat without inflicting damage, the Mongols allegedly resorted to a desperate tactic. According to historical accounts, they used catapults to hurl the bodies of dead soldiers over the walls of Kaffa, in an attempt to infect the city's inhabitants. This account was recorded by the Genoese notary Gabriel de Musis. While modern historians debate the veracity of this event, the very mention of such an act highlights the fear and desperation that this unknown disease inspired from the very beginning. Whether or not this event actually occurred, the disease soon began to spread further. Trading ships sailing the Black Sea unwittingly became carriers, spreading the deadly infection to new lands. The symptoms, as described by eyewitnesses, were terrifying. Those infected experienced a sudden high fever, accompanied by chills and intense pain. Within hours, a healthy individual could be reduced to a state of near death. Painful swellings, known as buboes, appeared on the body. These black or dark blue lumps typically developed in the armpits, neck, and groin, rapidly growing to the size of a chicken egg or even an apple. They were incredibly painful and eventually filled with pus. Simultaneously, the infected might experience severe internal and external bleeding. Dark spots appeared on the skin, and blood seeped from the nose and mouth. It was these black spots, or hemorrhages, that later gave the disease its infamous name, the Black Death. The most terrifying form of the disease was the pneumonic plague. Sufferers experienced severe respiratory distress, coughing up blood and rapidly losing strength, often dying within 1 or 2 days. Those infected with pneumonic plague became highly contagious, spreading the disease to family members and neighbors within hours. Even the most experienced medieval doctors admitted that they had never seen anything like it. The disease seemed to them to be nothing less than a message from the devil himself. The first ships carrying the plague arrived off the coast of Sicily in October 1347. Genoese vessels, sailing from Kaffa, entered the port of Messina. It quickly became apparent that something terrible was happening on board. Many crew members had died during the voyage, and the survivors were gravely ill and barely able to move. The city authorities attempted to turn the ships away, but it was too late. The disease had already made its way ashore and began to spread through the streets of Messina with alarming speed. Initially, the citizens did not grasp the magnitude of the threat, but within days, mass deaths began to occur. Chroniclers reported that people were seized by panic. Those who seemed perfectly healthy in the morning were dead by evening. The number of dead became so overwhelming that normal burial practices were quickly abandoned. Authorities began using mass graves, where bodies were piled up by the dozens and hundreds without ceremony. The corpses, covered in black spots, lay in the streets. People abandoned their homes and fled the city, only contributing to the further spread of the infection. Within weeks, the disease appeared in other cities on the island and then quickly spread to mainland Italy, primarily due to the active maritime trade. Trading ships laden with textiles, spices, and grain unwittingly became transports of death, spreading the contagion along the coast. By the end of 1347, infected ships had arrived in major trading ports such as Genoa and Venice. These cities, vital centers of European commerce, became the gateways through which the plague entered the heart of Europe. From Genoa, the infection rapidly spread to the port city of Marseille, reaching it in December 1347. From there, following trade routes and river valleys, the disease spread deeper into France. It moved along the Rhône River and reached Paris by mid-1348. From France, the epidemic quickly spread to Spain. In the spring of 1348, the plague was recorded in Barcelona and other major cities in Catalonia and Aragon. In just 6 months, the deadly infection had traveled from the Black Sea to the Atlantic coast, engulfing almost all of southern Europe. The events in densely populated and economically developed Italian cities, such as Florence and Siena, were particularly devastating. In these bustling commercial centers, life teemed daily, and crowds constantly gathered in the narrow streets. Chroniclers of the time, especially those from Siena, conveyed the despair of the local population. People were dying faster than they could be buried. Entire families disappeared in a matter of days. Bodies lay in the streets, covered in dark spots, and no one dared to approach them. Normal life ground to a halt. Shops and markets closed, and church services were cancelled. People were afraid to even open their doors and windows, lest they let in the deadly air. An atmosphere of despair reigned everywhere. In just a few months from its first appearance in the port of Messina, the plague had engulfed Sicily, penetrated the largest commercial centers of Italy, and then rapidly spread through southern France and Spain. The tragic descriptions preserved in the chronicles of the time show that these were only the initial strikes of the epidemic. But even then, Europe was beginning to understand that it was facing a disaster of unprecedented and terrifying proportions. In an attempt to halt the spread of the disease, authorities and city residents alike implemented various measures, but they were largely spontaneous and haphazard. Once it became clear that the infection was rapidly transmitted from person to person, city authorities began closing gates and prohibiting the entry of merchants, travelers, and pilgrims. Many settlements surrounded themselves with barricades and posted guards to prevent the entry of infected individuals from outside. However, such measures were usually taken too late. The disease had already managed to penetrate the city, and the residents trapped inside were doomed to even more rapid infection. In larger cities, many noble and wealthy individuals, immediately after the first reports of mass deaths, chose to abandon their homes and flee to country estates and castles. As a result, the streets were filled with desperate paupers and the sick, who had no one to care for them. Unattended homes were looted by marauders, exacerbating the general chaos and fear of an impending end of the world. Amidst the general helplessness of the authorities in the prevailing medical understanding of the 14th century, deeply rooted in Galenic tradition, posited that the human body was governed by 4 essential fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health, according to this doctrine, was contingent upon the harmonious equilibrium of these humors. Disease, therefore, was perceived as a manifestation of humoral imbalance. To restore this balance, physicians of the era frequently resorted to bloodletting, a practice that, in retrospect, often proved detrimental, further weakening the patient and potentially hastening their demise. In some instances, doctors would perform multiple bloodlettings daily, exacerbating the patient's condition and rendering them even more vulnerable. The miasma theory, another cornerstone of medieval medical thought, attributed the plague to bad air emanating from decaying organic matter, stagnant waste, or swampy environments. Consequently, efforts to prevent the disease centered on purifying the air. Throughout cities and towns, people lit bonfires in homes and streets, and burned incense and aromatic substances, hoping to cleanse the atmosphere. Some desperate citizens even resorted to setting their own homes ablaze, believing that a large conflagration would eradicate the disease. Individuals carried sachets filled with herbs like lavender, rosemary, and thyme, believing that their pleasant fragrances would ward off harmful miasmas. Others relied on the perceived protective power of magical amulets and talismans, hoping to deflect evil influences and noxious vapors. Prayers and religious chants echoed through the streets, But all these measures proved futile, as the true cause of the plague, a bacterium, remained unknown and unsuspected. Physicians themselves adopted protective measures, donning long, heavy cloaks and robes made of waxed fabric, hoping that the dense material would prevent contaminated air from reaching their bodies. Some doctors even avoided physical contact with patients, attempting to diagnose their condition from a distance, relying on observations of skin color and the patient's odor. Medical treatises of the time meticulously described the various stages of the plague and methods for diagnosis. For example, it was believed that the characteristic smell of a sick person could indicate the severity of their condition. However, none of these actions could halt the spread of the infection, as the true carriers of the disease remained undetected. Doctors debated the merits of different herbs and remedies, writing detailed instructions for treatment, but all this only created a semblance of control over the situation. In practice, people continued to die, and no methods or recipes brought relief. Despair, combined with the helplessness of citizens and physicians, led to a situation where the sick were often abandoned and left to die alone. People were afraid to approach them for fear of contagion, and there were not enough doctors and priests to care for all the victims. As a result, the dead lay in the streets for days until brave individuals could be found who were willing to remove the bodies for a fee. By the summer of 1348, the epidemic had fully engulfed continental Europe and began its movement towards the British Isles. England, seemingly isolated from the mainland by the English Channel, could not escape the invasion of the disease. In the autumn of that year, infected ships arrived in English ports, including Bristol, Southampton, and Weymouth. From there, the disease quickly spread inland, encompassing new settlements. The real peak of the epidemic occurred in 1348-49, which went down in English chronicles as the year of the Great Plague. By that time, the disease was raging in all corners of the kingdom, devastating major cities and remote villages. London, one of the largest cities in Europe at that time, became a place of true horror and chaos, which is described in detail by local chronicles and topographers. According to contemporaries, the capital of England turned into one large morgue. The bodies of the dead, which no one could bury, were stacked directly on the streets. City authorities desperately tried to organize the removal and burial outside the city walls, but could not keep up with the number of victims. Some chroniclers mention special carts that traveled daily through the streets collecting the dead. One witness wrote that there were so many bodies that they fell from the carts and remained lying there, as the gravediggers did not have the strength or time to lift them back. The population of London was gripped by panic. Shops and markets were closed, artisans stopped working, and houses stood empty or locked from the inside. People tried to avoid communication even with close relatives and neighbors, hoping to protect themselves from infection. The fear was so great that many of the sick were completely abandoned to their fate and died alone. The London authorities tried to maintain at least some order, urging residents not to go out into the streets unnecessarily and not to leave their homes. However, such measures did not produce results, as no one understood the true mechanism of the spread of the disease. King Edward III, along with his court, hastily left the capital and took refuge in the countryside, leaving the city practically without central government. The situation was aggravated by the fact that in England, as in other European countries, there were no effective sanitary services or effective methods of isolating the sick. Official authorities did not know how to react to the epidemic, and often simply limited themselves to calls for prayer and repentance. Church services and processions, initially organized to save lives, soon ceased, as priests also became massively ill and died, like ordinary citizens. Books of that time note that not only ordinary people died from the plague, but also noble families, artisans, merchants, and clergy. In some villages and small towns, almost all residents died, and the survivors left the deserted places, fearing to return. The catastrophic weakening of England at the height of the epidemic was attempted to be used by its neighbors. In 1348-49, when the plague was already raging in many English cities and villages, the Scots decided that this was the perfect moment to strike a crushing blow against their weakened adversary and invade the vulnerable territories of northern England. The Scottish army crossed the border, hoping for a quick and easy victory. But instead, the same terrible disease soon broke out in the Scottish camp itself. The outbreak was so sudden and powerful that soldiers began to die right on the march, and the army quickly decreased in number. The epidemic mowed down the Scottish army so much that the campaign had to be stopped immediately. The remnants of the army retreated back to Scotland in panic. However, they brought the disease with them, which began to spread rapidly now among the Scottish population. Soon the Scottish lands were plunged into the same nightmare that engulfed England. According to historians, as a result of the Great Plague of 1349, England lost about half of its population. For London, this figure was probably even higher. English chronicles testify that cities and villages stood in desolation. The fields remained uncultivated, and the roads were overgrown with grass, because traveling became dangerous and meaningless. As the disease continued to devastate European cities and villages, the despair and panic of the people reached their limit. Unable to understand the true causes of the epidemic, society began to look for those responsible among themselves, generating fear, hatred, and madness. One of the most striking and tragic manifestations of this despair was the mass movement of flagellants. The movement reached its peak in 1348-49. Flagellants were wandering groups of people who publicly scourged themselves with whips and lashes to atone for the sins of humanity and stop the epidemic. Uniting in large processions, dressed in simple shirts, they moved from city to city, loudly reciting prayers, singing psalms, and inflicting blows on themselves until blood flowed in front of shocked residents. Their appearance caused awe and horror at the same time. Priests and monks sometimes joined these processions, believing that only such harsh repentance could achieve God's mercy. However, it soon became clear that instead of alleviating the situation, the flagellants only increased panic and contributed to the spread of the disease. Church authorities began to treat the movement more and more negatively, realizing that the flagellants were challenging the official church, claiming that their repentance was more effective than the prayers and masses of priests. Eventually, Pope Clement VI publicly condemned the movement as heretical and banned it, and local authorities began to arrest and persecute participants in the processions. Gradually, the movement declined, but it clearly demonstrated how strong the shock of society was in the face of an incomprehensible and deadly epidemic. An even more terrible and destructive phenomenon was the mass pogroms of Jews. People sought explanations for the epidemic not only in God's punishment, but also in conspiracies. In thousands of villages and cities in Europe, rumors spread that Jews were allegedly deliberately poisoning wells and water sources in order to destroy the Christian population. Although there was no real evidence of this, many Europeans believed these rumors. A wave of cruelty and violence swept across Europe. Jews were grabbed right on the streets, tortured, demanding confessions, and executed, often burning entire families or even entire communities. The most terrible pogroms occurred in 1348-1349. A particularly brutal massacre took place in the city of Strasbourg on February 14, 1349, when several thousand Jews were captured, subjected to brutal torture, and then publicly burned alive on a large bonfire. Similar events took place in other cities of the Holy Roman Empire, France, and Spain. In some places, trying to save souls and preserve life, Jews were forced to be baptized and converted to Christianity. But more often, communities were simply destroyed without any possibility of justification. The situation reached the point that Pope Clement VI was forced to intervene personally, trying to stop the senseless killings. He issued a special papal bull in which he strongly rejected the accusations against the Jews and called on local rulers to protect them. However, the Pope's voice was not heard by everyone. Pogroms and burnings continued for a long time, claiming tens of thousands of lives, especially in the German lands and France. In some cities, Jewish communities were almost completely destroyed. Many Jews, fleeing persecution, fled to Poland and Lithuania, where they were provided with relatively safe conditions. In the insane atmosphere of that time, suspicions and accusations of witchcraft also periodically arose. Some people believed that the mysterious disease could have been caused by evil forces and began to accuse individual residents of secret conspiracies with the devil. From time to time, those suspected of witchcraft were indeed arrested and executed, often also by burning at the stake. But it is important to emphasize that such cases were not yet so frequent and massive at that time. Widespread and mass witch hunts became characteristic of Europe much later, in the 15th to 17th centuries, already after the end of the plague. However, even these isolated cases of accusations of witchcraft showed how great the despair was and how crazy people became in the face of a mysterious disease. The inability to understand the nature of the epidemic and the absence of any rational explanation led to outbreaks of cruelty and hatred, which became a tragic feature of the era of the Black Death. While in the south and west of Europe, the plague spread rapidly and claimed thousands of lives daily. In Central Europe and Scandinavia, the disease moved much more slowly and reached these lands with a noticeable delay. This was largely due to the geographical features of the region and its lesser involvement in active international trade routes, through which the infection spread so quickly in the southern and western parts of the continent. The plague penetrated Norway only in 1349. Scandinavian chronicles describe the arrival of a single English ship in the port of Bergen, the crew of which had almost completely died during the voyage. This episode became the starting point of the epidemic, which quickly engulfed the city and then spread throughout the country. From Norway, the disease began to penetrate into Sweden, where it arrived in 1350. Here, the plague spread through internal trade routes and caravans, which carried the infection deep into the territory. Despite the late arrival of the disease, its consequences for Scandinavia were as catastrophic as for other regions of Europe. Entire villages died out completely, and the population was reduced by more than half. It is noteworthy that Greater Bohemia was long considered a territory that, by the dawn of 1351, the initial, devastating wave of the Black Death had begun to recede across much of Europe. This abatement was not due to any single factor, but rather a confluence of circumstances that gradually slowed the plague's relentless march. The most significant reason was the sheer scale of the preceding mortality. The epidemic had already claimed an immense number of lives, and in certain regions, the population density had been so drastically reduced that the disease simply lacked sufficient hosts to maintain its rapid transmission. In essence, the plague had, in a grim and unintended way, exhausted its readily available fuel. Furthermore, those who had survived the harrowing ordeal of infection often acquired some degree of immunity, however limited or temporary. This newfound resistance, even if not absolute, contributed to a deceleration in the disease's spread. As the proportion of immune individuals within a community increased, the likelihood of new infections diminished, creating a natural barrier to the plague's progress. Alongside these biological factors, practical measures, however rudimentary, began to emerge within communities. The practice of isolating the sick, while often born of fear and desperation rather than scientific understanding, proved to be somewhat effective in containing outbreaks. Similarly, the abandonment of infected towns and villages, though a traumatic and disruptive response, inadvertently created zones of reduced transmission, preventing the plague from spreading further afield. Another crucial aspect of the plague's ebb was its pattern of dissemination. The disease did not spread uniformly or continuously, but rather in a series of discrete outbreaks. It would erupt in one area, burn through the susceptible population, and then subside, awaiting the arrival of new carriers to reignite the cycle. These new introductions of the pathogen became progressively less frequent as trade routes were disrupted and travel curtailed, thus limiting the plague's ability to establish new epicenters of infection. While the Black Death never entirely vanished and continued to manifest in sporadic outbreaks in subsequent years, the apocalyptic devastation of 1348 to 1350 was never replicated. The initial wave had inflicted such profound demographic damage that subsequent outbreaks, while still deadly, lacked the capacity to unleash the same level of societal collapse. The consequences of this initial epidemic were nonetheless staggering. Historians estimate that the Black Death claimed the lives of 25 to 50 million people in Europe, representing as much as half of the continent's total population. No prior catastrophe had approached this scale of human loss. Europe after the first wave of the plague was irrevocably transformed, not only demographically but also psychologically, socially, and economically. As the initial wave of the epidemic began to subside, a stark and unsettling reality emerged across Europe. The landscape bore the scars of unprecedented devastation. Where once bustling villages and fertile fields had thrived, now silence and desolation reigned. Thousands of settlements vanished entirely from the map, becoming what were known as dead lands, abandoned, ruined territories reclaimed by thorns and forests. In many regions, particularly in England, Germany, and France, entire areas were so depopulated that they remained uncultivated and uninhabited even decades after the epidemic. However, amidst this tragedy, an unexpected consequence arose for those who had survived. The immense loss of life created a severe labor shortage. Workers became so scarce that feudal lords and landowners were compelled to drastically increase wages in order to retain their existing workforce and attract new laborers. For the first time in generations, ordinary peasants and artisans experienced a tangible improvement in their material circumstances. They could now choose their employers, negotiate for better terms, and significantly raise their standard of living. But for the ruling nobility and large landowners, this shift presented a serious challenge and a threat to the established order. The feudal system, predicated on the serfdom of peasants and cheap labor, was shaken to its foundations. In an attempt to maintain control, the English authorities enacted the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which prohibited paying peasants more than they had received before the epidemic. The law also restricted the freedom of movement of peasants, forbidding them from leaving their villages in search of better opportunities without permission. In practice, however, these measures proved largely ineffective. The population had been so drastically reduced, and the demand for labor was so acute, that landowners often violated the law in order to secure workers. In France, the situation unfolded differently. While no direct laws were passed against raising wages, the authorities sharply increased taxes on peasants and ordinary townspeople. This burden was compounded by the ongoing Hundred Years' War, which had been raging between England and France for decades. French lands were ravaged by battles, and villages were subjected to regular pillaging by passing armies and mercenary bands, often composed of former soldiers who had turned to banditry. For the peasants, this meant a constant threat to their lives, livelihoods, and any possibility of rebuilding their farms after the epidemic. All of these factors combined to create a sharp increase in social tension in France. In the summer of 1358, a major peasant uprising erupted in the northern regions of the country, known as the Jacquerie. The name derived from Jacques Bonhomme, a derogatory term used by nobles to refer to common peasants. Thousands of peasants took to the streets and roads of northern France, attacking castles and manor houses, destroying property, and killing nobles. Chronicles describe the uprising as unprecedented in its cruelty and fury. The peasants' primary goal was to avenge the humiliation, taxes, injustice, and constant pillaging they had endured. They stormed estates, brutally murdered nobles and their families, and set fire to castles and monasteries. However, the uprising was short-lived, lasting only a few weeks in the summer of 1358. The nobility's response was swift and merciless. An army of knights and mercenaries was assembled, which brutally suppressed the rebellion. By various estimates, between 20,000 and 30,000 peasants were killed during the suppression of the Jacquerie. The leaders of the uprising were publicly executed as a warning to others, and villages that had supported the rebels were burned to the ground. Although the uprising was quickly crushed, it served as a significant signal, demonstrating how profoundly Europe had changed after the epidemic. Ordinary people were no longer willing to live as they had before, enduring humiliation and injustice. The feudal nobility realized, for the first time, that their power was no longer absolute. The consequences of the epidemic extended beyond economics and social life, exerting a profound influence on European culture, art, and spiritual life. The catastrophe forced people to reconsider their values. The inevitability and suddenness of death found expression in literature and painting. One of the most prominent cultural monuments born from the Black Death was the Decameron by the Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio. This book, written shortly after the epidemic in 1353, is a collection of stories told by 10 young people who have taken refuge from the plague in a country villa. The Decameron reflects the deep changes in the perception of the world, on the one hand, the tragic nature and transience of human life, and on the other, the attempt of people to at least temporarily isolate themselves from the horror and death with the help of humor, love, and earthly pleasures. Boccaccio's work became a symbol of the reaction of European culture to the horror of the epidemic for centuries, demonstrating the desire of man to preserve humanity even in the most terrible times. The theme of death became central not only in literature but also in the visual arts. Soon after the plague, the first depictions of the Dance of Death began to appear, famous scenes in which death, depicted as a skeleton, invites representatives of all walks of life into an endless dance, from the Pope and kings to ordinary peasants and children. The meaning of this motif was to show that all are equal in the face of death, and no one can escape its touch, no matter how rich, noble, or influential they may be. Such images first appeared in Germany and France, and then spread throughout Europe and became popular for centuries. No less well known was the theme of the triumph of death, which found vivid expression in numerous frescoes, the most famous of which were created in Italy. In these images, death appears as an all-conquering force, destroying cities and villages, leaving no one hope or mercy. People are depicted as helpless in the face of this elemental force, reflecting the tragedy and hopelessness of life during the epidemic. The changes that occurred in the religious and spiritual life of European society were no less profound. The catastrophe dealt a crushing blow to the authority of the Catholic Church, which proved unable to protect believers from the disease or even provide a reasonable explanation for what had happened. A huge number of priests and monks themselves became victims of the epidemic or fled from it, abandoning their parishes. Believers felt abandoned at the most difficult moment, and trust in the Church plummeted. Against the backdrop of the crisis of confidence, various mystical movements and sects began to spread in society, whose members claimed to have special knowledge about the causes of the disease and ways to escape it. Among them were groups of new mystics, prophets, and soothsayers who called on believers to prepare for the imminent end of the world. People massively recalled prophecies, especially the Apocalypse of John the Evangelist, which described terrible diseases and catastrophes preceding the end of time. In the minds of medieval people, the Black Death was perceived as one of those terrible and inevitable stages that were supposed to lead to the final judgment and the second coming of Christ. Apocalyptic sentiments gripped all sections of society, and many believers sincerely believed that they were living in the last days before the last judgment, and the only salvation was in repentance and prayer. At the same time, the Catholic Church faced a deep internal crisis. The papal curia and monasteries, which had previously enjoyed enormous authority, now faced massive disappointment from believers. Clergymen were accused of greed, inaction, cowardice, and even betrayal, as many of them abandoned the dying and did not fulfill their spiritual duty. This led to a gradual weakening of the authority of traditional church power and created the ground for the emergence of numerous heresies and schisms, which later became the cause of deep religious conflicts. In the long term, the plague epidemic pushed European society to seek new, more rational and practical approaches to combating epidemics. It became clear that the former religious and mystical methods did not work, and other measures were needed. It was during this period that the first sustainable sanitary institutions appeared, such as attempts to regularly clean cities of garbage, the introduction of primitive sanitary measures, and the regulation of trade, especially in the port cities of the Mediterranean. Although these first steps were imperfect and inconsistent, they became an important beginning for the development of public health and new ideas about hygiene and sanitation, which centuries later significantly changed the lives of Europeans. Although the first and most devastating wave of the Black Death ended in 1351, Europe could not completely get rid of the plague, which continued to return regularly and remind itself in subsequent centuries. A few years after the end of the first pandemic, people realized that the disease had not gone away forever but had become a permanent part of their lives. One of the first serious outbreaks after the Great Pandemic was the epidemic of 1361, which went down in history as the Children's Plague. The name is due to the fact that the disease particularly affected children and young people who were born after the first pandemic and had no immunity to the infection. This epidemic covered England, France, and part of continental Europe, claiming many lives and reminding people of the former nightmare. Although the Children's Plague was significantly weaker than the epidemic of 1348 in terms of scale, it was extremely painful for society psychologically, because it once again forced people to realize that danger remains a constant threat that they will have to live with for a long time. Throughout the late 14th and 15th centuries, Europe constantly faced repeated plague epidemics. People became accustomed to the fact that the disease returns again and again, periodically claiming thousands of lives. Gradually, fear and panic gave way to a sense of grim doom and fatalism. Society became accustomed to the constant. The city found itself grappling with a disease of such immense proportions that authorities resorted to some of the most draconian measures ever witnessed in European history. In Milan, officials decided to implement an extreme form of isolation, effectively entombing houses with infected individuals inside. The entrances and windows of afflicted homes were sealed with stone and brick, sometimes even nailed shut with wooden planks, preventing anyone from entering or leaving. Walls of these sealed houses were marked with special symbols and inscriptions, warning passers-by to keep a safe distance from the contaminated dwelling. However, this practice led to horrifying consequences. Residents trapped within these houses were condemned to a gruesome death from starvation and dehydration, even if they managed to survive the disease itself. Many desperately tried to escape, breaking through walls and doors, while others pleaded with passers-by for food and water. More often than not, their pleas went unanswered, as those outside feared contracting the infection. Contemporary chronicles paint a picture of a city consumed not only by the plague but also by cruelty and despair, leaving a profound scar on the collective memory of the time. Equally tragic was the epidemic that struck London in 1665, known to history as the Great Plague of London. Its horrors were vividly recounted by English writer and civil servant Samuel Pepys, whose diary became one of the most compelling testimonies of that era. The disease swept into densely populated London and spread throughout the city with alarming speed. Authorities desperately attempted to halt the infection's progress. Strict bans were imposed on mass gatherings, theaters were closed, and fairs, markets, and taverns were shut down. The doors of infected houses were marked with large red crosses, and guards were stationed outside to ensure that no one entered or left. Despite these measures, hundreds of people died daily, and the streets of London, as in the 14th century, were once again filled with carts carrying the deceased. In his diary, Samuel Pepys described his city living in constant fear and despair. People avoided even their loved ones, fearing any stranger, any suspicious noise, or cough. City life ground to a halt, streets emptied, and only a few desperate souls ventured out, covering their faces with cloths soaked in vinegar or aromatic oils, hoping to protect themselves from the plague. Wealthy residents, as before, fled the city, while the poor were forced to remain and await their fate. In addition to Pepys's diary, another famous account of those events is Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, written in 1722. Although Defoe himself was not an eyewitness to the 1665 epidemic, he meticulously studied the accounts of survivors and documents from that era, creating a strikingly realistic portrayal of city life during the epidemic. Defoe described horrifying scenes of the sick being thrown directly into the streets to prevent the infection of other family members. Often, those afflicted, in their despair, committed suicide, unable to endure the agony of the disease and their isolation. Following this catastrophic epidemic, London suffered another major disaster, the Great Fire of 1666. The fire destroyed a significant portion of the old city, especially the slums and poor neighborhoods that were the main centers of unsanitary conditions and breeding grounds for infection. Many contemporaries saw this fire as a purification, a divine intervention that rid the city of the remnants of disease and filth left behind by the epidemic. Although the fire was itself a tragedy, claiming lives and leaving tens of thousands homeless, it ultimately contributed to the reconstruction and improvement of the urban environment. In the end, London lost approximately 100,000 people, nearly a quarter of the city's population at that time. This tragedy, although the last major outbreak of plague in England, left a deep scar on the consciousness of the people, reminding them once again of how defenseless society remained in the face of epidemics. Also during this time, the famous plague doctors emerged, becoming one of the most recognizable symbols of European epidemics. Plague doctors, as a distinct profession, had existed before, but it was in the 17th century that they gained official status and a standardized image, transforming from random city healers into figures with a clearly defined social role and appearance. It was then, in 1690, that French physician Charles Delorme, court physician to King Louis XIII, proposed the famous costume that became the symbol of plague doctors. The attire included a long cloak made of leather or waxed fabric, gloves, high boots, a wide-brimmed hat, and, most importantly, a mask with a long, curved beak. This eerie and mysterious image quickly spread, especially in France and Italy, although in some European countries, doctors continued to do without such masks, not adopting this specific tradition. Particular attention was paid to the mask's beak, inside which doctors placed aromatic herbs and substances with strong odors, lavender, rosemary, thyme, camphor, and sponges soaked in vinegar. Filling the beak with herbs and vinegar was related to the prevailing theory of miasmas, according to which disease was transmitted through poisoned air. Doctors believed that strong aromas could purify the inhaled air and protect them from infection. Of course, these masks could not actually protect doctors from the plague, but they served an important psychological role, giving confidence to medical professionals and making a strong impression on the population. However, the perception of the population was far from uniform. For ordinary people, the appearance of a doctor in such a costume always meant the approach of trouble. People perceived the plague doctor as a harbinger of death, a grim, ominous symbol of impending tragedy. In some cities, there were even rumors that the doctors themselves brought the disease, rather than saving people from it. Because of this, plague doctors were both feared and respected. Another important element of the plague doctor's appearance was a special cane or stick. It served not only as a tool for remotely examining patients, measuring their pulse, or moving their clothing, but also as a symbol of authority and control over the situation. Doctors could use it to give instructions to assistants and sometimes to maintain order and enforce quarantines among frightened and desperate citizens. The plague doctor could easily transform from a physician into a strict guard, and the population perceived this with anxiety and fear. It is worth noting that the social and professional status of plague doctors was quite low. In the context of epidemics, there was a catastrophic shortage of experienced doctors, and young, inexperienced doctors, or even people without medical education, were often appointed to the position of plague doctor. Their main task was not so much treatment as the accounting of the sick and dead, the organization of isolation, and the enforcement of quarantine. Sometimes, this work was entrusted even to scribes and officials, as real medical assistance to the sick was practically impossible, and the doctor was only required to record the course of the epidemic. By the mid-17th century, quarantines and sanitary cordons had become a regular and mandatory practice in many cities. Armed guards were stationed around infected areas, streets were blocked with barricades, and any violation of quarantine was punishable by severe penalties, up to and including death. These measures reflected the desperate desire of the authorities to somehow stop the spread of infection and force the frightened population to follow the established rules. In several European cities, cases were documented where people were publicly executed, demonstrating the severity and uncompromising nature of the fight against the epidemic. Despite all the severity and shortcomings of the methods of that time, the emergence of specialized medical equipment for doctors and official sanitary measures was an important step towards the development of public health and epidemiology. The 18th century became a time when Europe experienced its last major outbreaks of plague, which ultimately changed society's understanding of the fight against infectious diseases. The last terrible epidemic of plague in Western Europe was the Marseille Plague of 1720. This epidemic began with the arrival of a ship called the Grand Saint-Antoine, arriving in Marseille from the eastern Mediterranean. On board the ship was an infected cargo of fabrics and other goods purchased in the Middle East. Despite established sanitary rules, city authorities made a fatal mistake and allowed the ship to enter the port. A few days later, the first cases appeared among the crew and port workers, after which the disease spread rapidly throughout the city. Marseille was one of the largest ports in Europe at that time and a densely populated trading center. This circumstance played a fatal role, as the plague began to quickly seize quarter after quarter, causing panic and complete chaos among the population. City authorities tried to correct their mistake and took urgent measures. Strict quarantines were introduced, city gates were closed, and entry and exit were prohibited. Inside the city, a desperate struggle for survival began. People tried to isolate themselves in homes and hospitals. Streets were cordoned off by armed guards, and the bodies of the dead were dumped into mass graves or simply left lying in the streets. But the measures were taken too late. Marseille lost about 40,000 people, almost half of its population. Neighboring villages and towns also suffered greatly, as the disease had managed to spread beyond the city. The epidemic claimed the lives not only of the poor but also of wealthy citizens, merchants, and officials, sparing no one. Despite this, the authorities made maximum efforts to contain the epidemic, and the disease was unable to spread far beyond the region. It was this epidemic that became the last such large-scale catastrophe caused by plague in Western Europe. However, in Eastern Europe, the plague continued to appear for some time. The largest and most tragic was the epidemic that swept through Moscow and the central regions of the Russian Empire in the 1770s. The cause of this epidemic was not only trade routes and merchant caravans but also military operations during the Russo-Turkish War. The disease penetrated Russian lands from the south, from where it was brought by returning soldiers and convoys. In Moscow, the plague spread with enormous speed, again causing panic and despair among the population. The authorities were unprepared for the epidemic, and initial isolation measures were weak and chaotic. Soon, the epidemic spiraled out of control. Moscow emptied, and the streets were full of the bodies of the dead, which no one was burying. The victims of the Moscow epidemic numbered more than 50,000 people, that is, approximately a quarter of the city's population. The authorities were forced to bring in troops and police to establish strict quarantine and order. A special plague commissariat was established to monitor compliance with quarantine measures. However, the residents of the city themselves were so frightened that the famous plague riot of 1771 broke out, when enraged citizens tried to smash quarantine outposts and monasteries, believing that the authorities and doctors were deliberately spreading the disease. In the end, the uprising was brutally suppressed. By the end of the 18th century, the plague had finally left Europe. The reasons for its disappearance were several factors. First, stricter control of trade routes and quarantine measures became the norm, not the exception. European countries began to constantly monitor ports, conducting strict sanitary inspections of arriving ships. Second, general living conditions and sanitation in cities improved. Streets were regularly cleaned of garbage, drainage ditches were covered, and the population began to pay more attention to personal hygiene. There was also a theory that the disappearance of the plague was associated with the displacement of the black rat, which was the main carrier of plague fleas, by the gray rat, which is less susceptible to such parasites. Scientists are still discussing this version, and although it is not considered the only one, it has a right to exist. However, most researchers emphasize that social and medical factors played the main role: the development of sanitary practices, the creation of permanent lazarettos, the introduction of quarantine systems, and the improvement of urban hygiene. The long-term legacy of the Black Death was a change in society's attitude to medicine and health. The plague showed all the helplessness of medieval medicine, forcing people to seek more rational and practical approaches to combating diseases. The first permanent hospitals were created, the streets of cities began to be systematically cleaned, and hygiene gradually became part of everyday life.